She made $3.7 million using my copyrighted framework, forgetting the license agreement already exposed her entire scheme. Catherine Voss generated $3,700,000 using a framework I had registered with the US Copyright Office 14 months before she launched, and the license agreement she had signed told her exactly what she was not allowed to do with it. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters here. The work did not happen overnight, and neither did the betrayal. I had spent nearly 2 decades in organisational consulting by the time I began developing what would become the Reed-Bridge engagement model. That name came from the bridge metaphor at the core of the methodology, the idea that organisational change is not a destination you arrive at, but a structure you build deliberately, one load-bearing element at a time. I had watched too many change management initiatives collapse, not because the strategy was wrong, but because the engagement architecture was never built to hold the weight of the transition. Teams would align on vision and stall on execution. Leaders would commit to transformation and then retreat when the resistance arrived. The frameworks available in the market were conceptually sound, but practically thin. They told you what change looked like. They didn't tell you how to build the conditions for it. That was the gap I was trying to close. In 2018, I began systematically documenting what I had been doing intuitively for years. I pulled thread after thread from completed engagements: notes, after-action reviews, client feedback, failure analysis. I sat with transcripts from difficult conversations inside organisations that had either navigated transitions well or collapsed under poor change architecture. I looked for the patterns, not in outcomes, but in process. What had been in place when things worked, and what had been absent when they didn't. I was not writing a book, I was writing a methodology. There's a difference. A book explains ideas. A methodology tells a practitioner exactly what to do, when to do it, and why the sequence matters. It's a working instrument, not a conceptual document. It has to hold up under the pressure of a real organisational environment: ambiguous sponsorship, mid-engagement leadership changes, resistance patterns that don't follow the theoretical models. If you're building a methodology, you have to build it for the messy middle, not for the clean version that appears in case studies. The first draft of the Reed-Bridge manual was 41 pages. It covered the core framework structure, the 5 engagement phases, the stakeholder alignment protocol, the resistance mapping tool, and the accountability cadence. I tested that draft with 2 clients in early 2019. Both engagements produced measurable outcomes. I documented those outcomes, refined the language, tightened the tools, and added specificity where the early draft had been too conceptual. By mid-2019, the manual had grown to 94 pages. I want you to understand what 94 pages of proprietary methodology represents. It's not filler. Every page carried a decision tree, a facilitation script, a template, or a diagnostic framework. There were 22 named tools inside that manual. Each one had been piloted in a real organisational environment. Each one had a specific function in a specific phase of the engagement sequence. This was a working system that I had built, tested, and documented over nearly 2 years. The naming conventions inside the manual were deliberate. I had coined specific terminology for certain concepts: diagnostic steps, facilitation approaches, accountability structures, because those concepts didn't have adequate labels in the existing change management literature. Some of those labels were technical, some were more evocative. All of them were mine. I had written them, used them in client work, and documented them as the proprietary language of the Reed-Bridge model. That language would later become one of the clearest evidence trails in the case against Voss, precisely because it was distinctive enough that its appearance in her materials was unmistakable. In September 2019, I registered the Reed-Bridge engagement model with the US Copyright Office. The registration covered the manual in its entirety: the narrative content, the frameworks, the tools, the facilitation scripts, the proprietary terminology, and its defined usage. The certificate came back dated September 2019. I filed it in a folder. That folder later became the first section of the audit file. Some people lose a company because they never read the clause that gave it to them. I had read every clause I had ever written, and I had registered the work before I licensed it to anyone. Catherine Voss came into my orbit through a referral. A former client had mentioned my name when she was looking for external support on an organisational restructuring initiative at her company. She was a senior executive, competent, polished, ambitious in the particular way that's visible across a conference table within the first 10 minutes. She asked smart questions in our initial conversations. She had clearly thought about the challenge her organisation was facing. She wasn't the kind of prospect who arrives looking for someone to validate a decision already made. She came in genuinely looking for a methodology that would work. We had 2 exploratory conversations before she engaged me formally. In the first, I explained the Reed Bridge approach at a conceptual level, the underlying philosophy, the phase structure, the emphasis on building engagement architecture before executing on change deliveries. She responded well to the framework logic. She asked specific, intelligent questions about how I handled resistance in phase 2 and about the accountability cadence in the later phases. In the second conversation, we talked through the scope of her organisational challenge in detail. I trusted her engagement. She presented herself as serious, prepared, and genuinely interested in solving the problem her organisation had. Looking back, I don't think that was entirely performance. I think she understood the value of the Reed Bridge model because she recognised a sophisticated piece of work when she encountered one. The issue wasn't that she didn't understand what she was receiving. The issue was precisely that she did. We structured a formal consulting engagement in mid-2019. The scope covered a 12-week organisational change initiative. As part of the engagement, I licensed the Reed Bridge engagement model for her company's internal use during the project. This wasn't unusual. Many of my engagements included a licensed component that allowed the client's internal teams to use the framework tools during and immediately after the active consulting period. It extended the value of the engagement and built the client's internal capability to sustain the changes after I stepped back. The license agreement was specific. It covered the company's internal use for the duration of the engagement and for a defined period afterward. It included explicit exclusions: no sublicensing, no independent commercialization, no public distribution of the methodology or its derivative materials without written consent. These were not buried provisions. They were in a section titled Scope and Limitations of License, and the exclusion language appeared in its own clause, clearly stated, in plain language that required no legal interpretation to understand. I walked her through the agreement. That was part of my onboarding practice. I didn't hand clients a 94-page document and assume they had read it. I spent time with the framework, explained the tool structure, walked through the engagement phases, and reviewed the key provisions of the license. She was engaged throughout. She asked follow-up questions about the post-engagement use window. She understood exactly what she was receiving and exactly what the terms were. The engagement went well. Her internal team responded to the framework. The stakeholder alignment work in phases 1 and 2 produced the kind of early buy-in that change initiatives need to build momentum. The resistance mapping tool surfaced dynamics in her leadership team that hadn't been visible through conventional assessment approaches. Once named and documented, they were manageable. The restructuring initiative moved through the phases on schedule. By the time we closed the active engagement, there were measurable improvements in stakeholder alignment scores, and she had what looked like a functioning internal change management capability. I considered it a clean, successful engagement. After the engagement closed, there was standard follow-up, a final report, a wrap-up conversation, the usual transition documentation. And then, as these things go, we moved into the natural professional distance that follows the end of a client relationship. I had other engagements, she had her own work. We were not in regular contact. I had no particular reason to stay close to her, and she gave no particular indication that she intended to stay close to me. Professional silence after an engagement ends is normal, expected even. You don't stay in close contact with every client. Some relationships evolve into something ongoing. advisory arrangements, repeat engagements, referral networks. Most conclude cleanly, and both parties move on. I didn't track Catherine Voss's LinkedIn feed. I didn't monitor her career moves. I had licensed her access to my framework for a defined scope. The engagement was complete, and I had no reason to believe that was anything other than a closed chapter. From the end of the active engagement in late 2019 through the early months of 2020, there was nothing. No contact, no referrals, no indication of any kind that our professional paths were going to intersect again. I wasn't watching, and someone operating with a certain degree of calculation might have counted on exactly that. The email looked ordinary until I read the attachment. It arrived from a colleague, someone I'd known for years, a consultant who operated in adjacent practice areas with overlapping visibility into some of the same client organisations. The message was brief. Sophia, thought you should see this. Might be nothing. Attached was a screenshot of a LinkedIn post. The post was from Catherine Voss. She had recently launched her own consulting practice, given it a clean, professional brand, and the post described what she called a proprietary organisational engagement framework she had developed through years of executive experience. She wrote about the depth of her methodology, the rigour of her diagnostic tools, and the measurable results her clients were achieving. It was well written. It was confident. It read exactly like the kind of thought leadership post that positions a new practice as credible and distinctive. The language tracked my original documentation almost precisely. Not paraphrased, not inspired by. The phrasing mirrored my materials in ways that went beyond coincidence or common professional vocabulary. The 5-phase structure appeared. She had renamed the phases, but the sequence was identical to the Reed Bridge model. The post described a stakeholder alignment protocol and a resistance mapping approach. Those were not generic consulting terms. Those were specific named tools from my manual. The accountability cadence she referenced in the closing paragraph was described using language I had written, adjusted just enough to avoid direct quotation. I read the post twice. I printed it and set it aside. I didn't respond to my colleague immediately. I didn't send Catherine Voss a message. I didn't post anything publicly or call anyone in my network. I kept the screenshot in a folder on my desktop and noted the date. What I was looking at was either a coincidence born of shared professional experience, or it was the beginning of something considerably more serious. I needed more information before I drew any conclusions, and I wasn't willing to act on one data point. Not because I doubted what I was seeing, but because one data point, no matter how suggestive, isn't a case. I noticed, I filed it, I waited. The second signal arrived about 6 weeks later, and it came from an entirely unexpected direction. Not from my professional network, not from a colleague, not from any channel I'd been monitoring. It came from a prospective client who reached out through a standard inquiry. During our initial discovery call, she mentioned that she had come across my firm through a referral. Specifically, she said she had spoken with someone who had worked with both firms, meaning mine and Catherine Voss's. She was in the early stages of evaluating consulting partners for an organisational initiative. She was doing what any diligent buyer does, talking to multiple vendors, comparing offerings, developing a point of view on differentiation. She asked smart questions. She had clearly done her preparation. And then she used a phrase I did not expect to hear from someone I had never met. She used a term I had coined, a specific phrase from the Reed Bridge manual that described a particular diagnostic step in phase 3 of the engagement model. It wasn't generic language. It wasn't drawn from standard change management literature. It was a phrase I had constructed deliberately in my own documentation to name a concept that had no established label in the broader professional vocabulary. I had used it consistently in my work and in my materials since 2018. It appeared in the manual, it appeared in the facilitation scripts. It was a piece of the Reed Bridge model's specific intellectual property. She used it as though it were standard industry vocabulary, because someone had presented it to her that way. I asked where she had encountered that terminology. She told me she had reviewed materials from Voss's firm as part of her vendor evaluation. She described Voss's methodology guide as comprehensive and well organised. She appeared to assume the terminology was simply part of the professional lexicon in change management consulting, the way you do when a vendor's materials are your first exposure to a concept, and there's nothing to tell you it was invented somewhere else. I kept the call professional. I made no comments about Voss. I thanked the prospective client for her time, told her I'd follow up with a proposal, and ended the call. Then I opened the folder on my desktop where I'd saved the LinkedIn screenshot from August. I looked at the two items together. The language in Voss's materials had been presented to a prospective client as original thinking, attributed to no prior source, as the product of Voss's own professional development. That prospective client was now sitting in a vendor evaluation, comparing Voss's offering to mine, with no awareness that she was looking at two versions of the same thing, one registered in September 2019 and one that had appeared in November of that same year. Two data points. They were beginning to form a line. In October, one of my senior associates, someone who had been with me since 2017 and knew the Reed Bridge material as well as anyone, came into my office and closed the door. She said she had something I needed to see. She had been doing background research after the September call, following up on a thread she'd started pulling, and she had found Voss's website. She placed her laptop on my desk and turned it toward me. It was a well-designed site, professional branding, clean layout, the kind of presentation that signals real investment, not a freelancer's site, but a firm's site. It had a homepage, a services page, an about section, and a methodology page. The methodology page described what Voss called her proprietary organisational change framework in structured, specific terms. A downloadable guide was available, gated behind a simple email capture form. My associate had already downloaded it. She placed two documents on my desk, side by side. The left was a printed excerpt from the Reed Bridge Engagement Model Manual, Phase 2 and Phase 3 of the framework, including the resistance mapping tool and the diagnostic step I had named in my own proprietary language. The right was the downloaded guide from Voss's website, the same corresponding section. The structure was identical, section by section, phase by phase. The facilitation tools had been renamed and reformatted. The cover had a different title and Voss's firm's branding. The page layouts were different. But the underlying architecture, the sequencing logic, the decision points, the diagnostic framework, the accountability structure, and the specific conceptual language of several key tools was pulled directly and comprehensively from the Reed Bridge model. If you had built the original and you were looking at the derivative, there was no ambiguity about what you were seeing. She did not launch what she thought she owned. My associate was quiet. She knew what she was looking at, and she knew what I was thinking. There was no version of this comparison that left room for interpretation. The differences between the two documents were cosmetic. The structure was the same, the logic was the same, the intellectual architecture was the same. I had built it, documented it, and registered it, and it was sitting in a reformatted guide on someone else's website, available for download by anyone who provided an email address. But that was not the part that gave me pause. The part that gave me pause was the case studies. Voss's website included a section of client case studies. They were well written and specific enough to be credible, structured to demonstrate the kinds of results that organisations want to see before they commit to an engagement. I read through them carefully. The outcomes described were consistent with the documented impact metrics of the Reed Bridge model. The language used to describe the methodology's effect within client organisations mirrored the framework's specific performance vocabulary. I recognised the phrasing not because it was vaguely familiar, but because I had written it. And then I found one that stopped me. One of the case studies described an organisational engagement that I recognised, not because I had read about it in the market, but because I had been part of it. The client described the organisational dynamics, the resistance patterns, and the inflection point that had occurred midway through the initiative. I knew that engagement. I had run that engagement. I had documented it in my internal records and used it as a reference case in my own after-action reviews. Voss had been present for that engagement as a client. She had experienced the ReedBridge model from the client side, watched it work, and participated in the change process I had designed and facilitated. She knew what the outcomes looked like because she had lived them, and she had taken that knowledge, that experience, those details, and reframed them in a case study attributed to her own methodology. She had not just rebranded my framework, she had been actively positioning herself, in writing, to prospective clients as the architect of outcomes that she had witnessed as a client of mine. She was using the story of a ReedBridge engagement to sell her version of the ReedBridge model to organisations that had no way of knowing the difference. The room thought I was quiet. The minutes knew I was right. I looked at the case study for a long time. My associate was still standing across the desk. Neither of us said much. The evidence was in front of us. The two documents side by side, the case study on the screen, and the full picture of what had been happening over the prior 12 months, assembling itself with uncomfortable clarity. I put the printed comparison on top of the LinkedIn screenshot and the notes from the September call. I straightened the stack. I didn't make any calls that evening. I want to be precise about what I did after my associate left my office that October afternoon. I didn't draft a cease and desist letter. I didn't call Catherine Voss. I didn't forward the website to colleagues or post anything publicly or reach out to anyone who had worked with both of us. I didn't call my attorney that night. I sat with the file. I've been in business long enough to understand that the worst decisions are made in the heat of discovery. When you find something that confirms what you suspected, particularly when the confirmation is as complete as this was, there's a strong instinct to move, to confront, to correct, to call someone immediately and begin the process of action. That instinct is real, and it isn't always wrong, but it's almost never the path to the best outcome. What mattered here wasn't the confrontation. What mattered was the outcome, the cessation of unauthorised use, and the appropriate remedy for the commercial benefit Voss had derived from that use. The fastest path to that outcome wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a clean, dated, fully documented legal record. I had a copyright registration dated September 2019. I had a license agreement with explicit exclusion language. I had a side-by-side comparison demonstrating that the downloadable guide on Voss's website was a structural derivative of my registered manual. I had a client case study on her website that I could cross-reference against my own engagement records. I had a prospective client who had used my proprietary terminology as though it was standard vocabulary obtained from Voss's materials. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was constructed, dated, and documented. What it needed was a professional to organise it correctly and deploy it in the right sequence. I spent that evening reviewing my own files. I pulled the original copyright registration certificate from the folder where it had lived since September 2019. I pulled the 2019 engagement agreement with Voss, the full agreement, not just the license section. I pulled the license scope page. I found the clause, the one titled Scope and Limitations of License, with the explicit exclusion of sublicensing and independent commercialization. I read it again. I read every word of it, slowly. The language was clear. It had always been clear. It was clear when she signed it, and it was clear now. Then I put the documents in a folder, set them on my desk, and went home. The next morning, I called my attorney. My attorney had handled intellectual property matters for me before. She was methodical, direct, and experienced in exactly this kind of dispute. Not intimidating, not theatrical, but precise. I sat down in her office the morning after and walked her through everything. The LinkedIn post from August, the September call with the prospective client, the October website discovery and the side-by-side comparison, the case study. I laid the documents out in the order I had organised them. She read through them without interrupting me. When she finished, she picked up the license agreement and flipped directly to the scope and limitations page. She read the exclusion clause. Then she read it again. "When was your copyright registered?" she asked. I told her, September 2019. She pulled up a browser and found Voss's public launch date, cross-referenced against archived versions of the website and the public record of her practice's establishment. The earliest evidence of Voss's public commercialization dated to November 2019. My attorney looked up at me. "Your registration predates her public launch by more than a year." That was the first agenda item I saved. She asked what outcome I was looking for. I told her, cessation of all unauthorized use, acknowledgement of the infringement, and damages proportionate to the commercial benefit Voss had derived from the use of my work. I was clear that I had no interest in a public campaign or industry publicity. I wanted her to stop. I wanted compensation for the revenue she had generated using a methodology she had not built and had not been authorized to commercialize. My attorney began building the audit file. The binder she assembled was methodical and complete, the kind of document construction that doesn't leave gaps for opposing counsel to work into. She organized it in 4 sections. The first held the original copyright registration certificate from the US Copyright Office, dated September 2019, bearing the registration number and the full description of the covered work. The second section held the 2019 engagement agreement between my firm and Voss's company, with the scope of work and the signature page. The third section held the license scope page, with the exclusion clause highlighted in yellow, the specific language that prohibited sublicensing, independent commercialization, and public distribution of the methodology or its derivative materials. The fourth section held the comparison documentation, the side-by-side analysis of the Reed Bridge Manual and Voss's downloadable guide, the case study cross-reference, the archived screenshots of her public materials, and the notes from the September prospective client call. That binder sat on my attorney's desk for the first formal review. It sat on the conference table during both sessions with Voss's legal team. It sat on the table at the settlement signing. Every time it appeared in a room, it had the same effect. It concentrated the conversation on the fact that there was a dated, registered, documented record, not a dispute between competing recollections, a timeline. And that timeline began with a registration date that predated everything Voss had claimed to have built. As my attorney prepared the formal filing, her team conducted a commercial analysis of Voss's practice. This wasn't a speculative exercise. Voss had been public, active, and visible in her marketing. She had a documented client roster, published case studies with named organizations, and a clear pattern of engagements she had publicly promoted. The analysis drew on publicly available information, professional registration records, and the engagements Voss had publicized in her own materials. The number came back at $3,700,000. That was the estimated revenue Voss's consulting practice had generated between November 2019 and November 2020. 12 months. $3,700,000. Generated using a methodology whose copyright registration one held, under a license that explicitly prohibited the commercialization she had built her entire practice around. I remember sitting across from my attorney when she shared that number. I didn't express surprise. What I felt was something much quieter than surprise. I had spent 2 years building that methodology. I had registered it before I licensed it to anyone. I had written the license agreement carefully and walked clients through the restrictions, and in the 12 months after that work was licensed to one client for a defined internal use, it had generated $3.7 million for someone who had contributed nothing to its creation. She had been paid, very well, for a framework she did not build, and the document trail said so in precise, dated language. My attorney issued the formal cease and desist in November 2020. The letter was specific and documented. It named the infringement, cited the copyright registration by number and date, referenced the license agreement and its exclusion provisions, and outlined the remedies my firm was pursuing. It gave Voss's counsel a defined response window before we proceeded with a formal copyright infringement claim. The letter wasn't written to intimidate, it was written to inform, precisely and without excess language. A well-drafted cease and desist does one thing well. It tells the other party exactly where they stand, legally and factually, before the situation escalates into formal litigation. Ours did exactly that. Voss's legal team responded within the defined window. Their initial position attempted to contest the characterization of her materials as derivative, the standard opening in these situations. They argued that her framework had been developed independently, drawing on her own executive experience and professional history. My attorney was ready for that. She sent the side-by-side analysis. She sent the section-by-section comparison of the 94-page ReadBridge manual against the downloadable guide. She sent the dated copyright registration certificate and the license agreement with the exclusion clause highlighted. She sent the case study cross-reference, identifying the specific engagement Voss had publicly attributed to her own methodology. And she sent the commercial analysis establishing the $3.7 million revenue figure. Then she noted, calmly, in writing, that the copyright registration predated Voss's public launch by 14 months. Voss's legal team did not contest the timeline. From the date of the formal cease and desist to the date of settlement was 90 days. I want to be honest about what those 90 days looked like on my side, because it wasn't 90 days of relief or forward momentum. It was sustained work, documentation reviews, legal consultations, 2 formal sessions with opposing counsel. My attorney managed the process with precision and kept me informed at every stage. I reviewed everything she sent. I stayed focused on the outcome. The audit file appeared at every significant juncture in those 90 days. My attorney carried it to the first formal session with Voss's legal team, and it was on the table when she walked through the evidence structure. It was there when opposing counsel made their single serious attempt to negotiate the scope of damages, arguing that not all of Voss's consulting revenue could be attributed to the unauthorized use of the framework, that she had brought her own client relationships and business development capability to the engagements. It wasn't an unreasonable argument, and we engaged with it seriously. My attorney's counter was straightforward. The framework was not incidental to Voss's practice. It was the practice. Her website positioned it as her core proprietary offering. Her marketing materials led with it. Her case studies were built around it. Her client acquisition language was constructed around the credibility of having a distinctive proprietary methodology. Strip the framework out, and there was no practice. The attributable revenue calculation held, and Voss's counsel knew it. The settlement was reached in February 2021. Voss paid $2,100,000 in damages. She agreed to cease all use of the ReadBridge engagement model and all derivative materials, immediately and permanently. She agreed to take down the website content, the downloadable guide, and all associated marketing materials. She agreed not to represent the methodology as her own work in any future professional context. The settlement was signed in a conference room at my attorney's firm. The audit file binder was on the table. I remember the moment my attorney placed it there. The 4-section binder, organised and indexed, the copyright certificate visible through the clear cover of the first section. Everyone in that room understood what it represented. There was no need to discuss it. I signed my name at the bottom of the settlement agreement. I didn't address Voss or her counsel directly. My attorney handled everything professionally, efficiently, and precisely, as she had throughout. When the signing was complete, I picked up my copy of the agreement, thanked my attorney, and left. There's no version of that moment that felt triumphant to me. What I felt was closer to resolution, the particular quiet that follows the end of something that should not have required the process it did. I had built a methodology. I had registered it. I had licensed it with explicit restrictions. When those restrictions were violated, I had the documentation to establish exactly what had happened and exactly when. That's not a victory in any celebratory sense. It's the record speaking clearly, the way a well-kept record does when it finally needs to. I've thought about Catherine Voss's decision making in the months between the end of our engagement and November 2019, when she launched her practice. I've considered what assumptions were in operation when she decided to build a consulting business around a licensed methodology. Whether she believed the cosmetic changes created sufficient legal distance, whether she assumed I wouldn't notice, or would notice too late, or would calculate that pursuing the matter wasn't worth the time and expense. I don't know which of those was true. What I know is that the decision was made without serious regard for a copyright registration filed 2 months before she launched, and without serious regard for the license agreement she had signed, walked through, and agreed to. The exclusion clause was in its own section. The language was plain, the restrictions were specific. She had been present when I reviewed those terms with her. Some people assume that because an agreement was signed in the past, its terms are either forgotten or functionally unenforceable. Some people confuse the absence of immediate objection with the absence of a record. They see professional distance, an engagement that has closed, a consultant who has moved on, and they read that distance as indifference or as an opportunity. Documentation doesn't deteriorate. A copyright registration from September 2019 says exactly the same thing in November 2020 that it said the day it was issued. The license agreement carries the same language. The exclusion clause has the same meaning. The record doesn't forget, even when the person who made it appears to have moved on. And it doesn't require a confrontation to speak. It speaks through the date on the registration certificate and the clause that no one thought would ever need to be cited. The $2,100,000 was paid in full within the settlement window. When it cleared, there were the obvious practical matters: legal fees, business accounting, reinvestment in the firm. I handled those systematically. And then I did something I had been thinking about for a while. I took half of the settlement and opened a financial account in Maya's name. Maya is my daughter. She was in her mid-20s at the time, building her own professional life, navigating the particular combination of capability and uncertainty that defines those early years for anyone with real ambition. She was doing the work, building skills, making her way in her field, conducting herself with the kind of seriousness that makes you confident about someone's trajectory, even when the outcome is still years away. What she didn't have was a financial asset in her own name, not one that represented a meaningful foundation, something she held independently, not contingent on an employer or circumstance or any particular outcome going exactly right. That account was the first dedicated financial asset Maya has ever held in her own right. I didn't make a ceremony of it. I told her simply, the settlement had come from protecting work I had built, and half of it was now hers to build from. She understood the significance without needing it explained at length. Some things carry their own weight, and the right response is to receive them quietly. What I'll say is this: the Reed Bridge engagement model, which I spent 2 years building and 1 attorney and 90 days defending, did more than generate a settlement. It generated a foundation, and that foundation is now in Maya's hands, not in the hands of someone who assumed the original author had moved on. I don't tell this story as a warning about the dangers of client relationships or as a case for professional paranoia. I extend trust appropriately, and I expect professional conduct in return. Most of the time, in most relationships, I receive it. The lesson here is narrower than that. It's about the habit of documentation as a professional practice, not as a defensive posture, but as the discipline of someone who takes their own work seriously. I registered the Reed Bridge engagement model before I licensed it to anyone, because I believed in the work and I understood how intellectual property operates in a consulting context. I wrote the license agreement carefully because the scope restrictions were real and the exclusions were consequential. I kept the registration certificate, the engagement agreement, and the license scope page in a physical folder because documents don't protect themselves. You have to know where they are, and they have to exist in the first place. When my attorney assembled the audit file, she wasn't creating anything new. She was organising what I had already built. Every document in that binder existed before the November 2020 discovery. Every date was prior. Every clause had been written, signed, and filed before any of the red flags arrived. The protection wasn't reactive. It had been built into the foundation of how I managed my intellectual property from the beginning, before the engagement, before the license, before anyone else had ever touched the work. That's not a dramatic insight, it's a professional habit. But professional habits, applied consistently and without drama, have a way of mattering precisely at the moment when someone has assumed you weren't paying attention. The audit file binder is still in my attorney's files. I have my copy of the settlement agreement. I have the original copyright registration certificate in the same folder where it has lived since September 2019. The one I pulled out that October evening, read again carefully, and set back on my desk before I went home. There's a version of this story where I respond to the August LinkedIn post with an immediate message to Voss, or where I call her in October after my team finds the website, or where I spend weeks asking colleagues for their perspective before I take any formal action. In each of those versions, the outcome is less clean, the timeline is longer, the record is muddier than it needs to be, and the result, if it comes at all, arrives later and costs more. The reason the 90-day settlement happened was that the record was clean when it needed to be. The copyright was registered before the license was issued. The agreement was signed and documented. The exclusion language was specific and unambiguous. When my attorney placed the audit file on the conference table, there was nothing left to argue about. The documents told the story in sequence, with dates, in plain language. There was no gap to contest. She did not launch what she thought she owned. The registration said so. And the registration was 14 months older than anything she had ever claimed to have built. Quiet records have a way of speaking at the right moment. You just have to make sure you have them. Before I go, has anyone here had a proprietary method or process used commercially by someone who had licensed it from you? And was the license agreement the document that ended the dispute? I'd like to hear your experience in the comments. These situations are more common than most people discuss publicly, and the specifics always matter. And if stories like this remind you that experience is not weakness, subscribe to my channel for more, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the minutes.